All right, well, this last section, we will deal with some issues regarding optimize your brain. By the way, during the break, I was answering one of the questions from a WAU professor about what we can do at our colleges to help our students with their brain optimization and emotional intelligence. And this is one of the things we do at Weimar. In fact, it's a required freshman class. It's called Optimize Your Brain, and I am the teacher of that class, but the subtitle is How to Enhance Your Emotional Intelligence. And this is a class where half of the grade is based on participation in activities that are going to greatly enhance your IQ as well as your EQ. And I think one of the reasons why our students excel has to do with what they learn in that program and what they begin to incorporate. Not the program, that's actually a class, but the class becomes kind of a program, and it really helps to launch them for future success. And so we'll talk a little bit about aspects of that now. We'll see if we have this loaded up on the screen. I don't know if we have it yet. Yes. Revelation 22, verse 4 says, "And they shall see his face, and his name shall be where? In their foreheads." Where IQ and EQ come together is in the frontal lobe of the brain. Now, the temporal lobe is involving memory, and the limbic system inside the brain and lower brain is involving emotion. And there's areas that have to do with athleticism, the cerebellum. But where IQ and EQ come together is there in the frontal lobe of the brain. And according to results of a study that followed thousands of students throughout their college careers, the higher education system is effectively broken. A lot of times people make this big deal about, is the college accredited or not? And it turns out the studies are showing that the regional accreditation system itself is broken. The results show that many students are leaving college with degrees, but little to no improvement in what? Critical thinking or complex reasoning skills. They're able to answer test questions back on how the teacher wants them to answer enough to be able to pass, but it actually hasn't helped their brain in the process. New York University sociologist Richard Arum, lead author of the study, reports that after following over 2,000 typically aged college students, he found that a whopping 45% showed no improvement in higher reasoning and critical thinking skills after 2 years. These were Ivy League schools, by the way. 36% managed to go 4 years and obtain a bachelor's degree with no improvement whatsoever. The study also found that while more selective schools had higher overall success, all 24 universities involved had small groups of presumably self-motivated kids who were learning a lot among a majority who were just getting by. The most successful students tended in these schools to do what? Work on their own, rather than studying or working in groups. While one aspect of this could have to do with self-motivation or simply study habits, another reason that surfaced is that these students don't like to group up because the majority of those groups are kids from the 45% who still haven't grasped critical thinking. And so when there's groups that form, you end up being dragged down by the group itself. Many graduates, yes, people who graduated, had trouble sifting fact from fiction. You'd think after a 4-year college degree, you might get better at that. Addressing subjects objectively, reconciling and analyzing conflicting reports of a single event, and making decisions and arguments based on what? Fact and logic without being affected by appeals to emotion or what else? Political spin. Now these are what they're measuring as far as critical thinking is concerned, but these are things that we would tend to ask from functional citizens whether they have a degree in art, history, biochemistry, or nothing at all, but they could not be performed by a large percentage of college graduates from prestigious universities. And thus, the authors of the study say our accreditation system is academically adrift, limited learning occurring on college campuses. Now, these are educators themselves that are researching this. And so they have been able to actually speak at educational accreditation summits and things. It's a very good book, by the way, if you want to look at it and see what's going on in our educational systems. But unfortunately, well, let me just ask you this. If a student didn't go to college at all, but just worked on a farm for 4 years, what do you think would happen to their critical thinking skills? It would actually get much better. Much better than actually going to an Ivy League school. Why is that the case? It takes 30 years for the frontal lobe to be fully and structurally developed, and working with your hands, outdoors, and planning, and doing agriculture and gardening and the exercise that involves in it will actually do a better job at improving your complex thinking skills than going to a typical Ivy League school. We had a student at Weimar. He's a junior student this year, and he didn't get accepted into Weimar, his first attempt, for good reason. He had been in jail from age 15 to 17, was a very challenged kid, and when he got out of jail, his mom didn't even want him to come home because he was such trouble. And he went to a place called Advent Home, and his life started to turn around. And out of that, he was able to graduate from high school, and he applied to Weimar College. I'm not part of the enrollment committee, but the enrollment committee turned him down. And then we got a call from someone who knew someone who worked at Advent Home and said, can you please reconsider and maybe accept him on probation or something, but this kid is really trying to turn around. And we think he's a good kid underneath it all. He just needs to have the right environment. And so the Weimar Enrollment Committee did accept him on probation. What did this kid want to become? Anyone want to guess? He wanted to become a doctor. And you know, for some kids, I might just tell them becoming a doctor is not for everybody. You know, he was a very challenged kid, didn't have much academics, you know, took a GED, and now he's taking classes like chemistry, biology, and he's very challenged. His first grade was a C- on a test, and then a D+. Not looking good for getting into medical school. But he was also taking Optimize Your Brain. And he learned in Optimize Your Brain that one of the ways of optimizing your brain is to work with your hands in 3 dimensions in an agricultural setting. It's a requirement at Weimar to work at least 6 hours a week. Even though you might have all the money in the world, everyone has to work. But he had a more desk-type job that he was given. And he asked if he could go work in the farm after taking Optimize Your Brain. Now, our farm manager is very hard to work for because you have to work hard if you want to work in the farm. And he also has this rule. You can't work in the farm unless you're working 20 hours a week. And so he told them, yeah, you can come work here, but it's 20 hours a week, and you're already being challenged in school. I don't know if you want to do this. And Lance said, I'm going to do it, even if it's 20 hours a week, because what I'm doing right now is not working. So he started to work with his hands, vigorous gardening for 20 hours a week. What do you think happened to his grades? They went up considerably. He started to be able to grasp the material. He started on the right sleep-wake schedule where he could make more melatonin, early to bed, early to rise. And pretty soon he was getting scores like B+ and A-. And this last year he was taking physics and organic chemistry and he was scoring A's and A minuses. This last year, he took a class at Weimar called Research Methods. And you know, we have a lot of data that we're accumulating at Weimar. And he was looking at this, and the head of the class says, so what is it that you'd like to study? You know, we can do all sorts of data analysis. He said, I'd like to study all the people who've gone through the 8-week program who have come from very challenged split homes. The reason why he had an interest in that was because he came from a challenged split home. And a lot of the dysfunction that occurred to him was in part due to the fact that he was raised in a very divided, dysfunctional home. And he began to do all this data analysis and began to do the statistics behind it. He had taken the class statistics and research and was putting this into use, and found out that those who go through the 8-week program, and there were certain elements of the 8-week program that were very important, actually, even though they come from very challenged homes, even homes of abuse and trauma, that they get significantly better on the 8-week program. And so he put the abstract together, and Harvard University accepted it. And he went out to Harvard last year and presented his findings. And then he told his own story. Lance is going to be a physician. I can guarantee he'll do well in his MCAT, and he's going to go to medical school. But he is a young man that would have been written off as impossible. But yet his brain has changed. Intelligence is our capacity to learn, retain, and what else? Apply knowledge. It's often measured by an IQ test. It's related somewhat to academic performance. As I mentioned earlier today, college graduates' first job after graduation has been found to be related to their IQ. And there are advantages of high intelligence. You're more efficient in studying. Is that a good thing? Yeah, you can live a more balanced life, still be on an exercise program and a rigorous thing like medical school. You're more creative, you're more logical, you're more persuasive, your influence goes up, and you're more likely to become wealthy. There's another advantage. This was a Harvard University study showing the higher your IQ, the less risk of dying during a given period. For example, those with a childhood IQ of 150 had a 44% lower risk of death than those with an IQ of 135. And so IQ is actually also related to longevity. Now, at the time, they weren't sure why. We're learning more of the reasons why. That study was published in 2005. But intelligence, of course, involves the temporal lobe, where memory is. The occipital lobe is our spatial orientation, our vision. Parietal lobe is calculation, division, subtraction, vocabulary. Cerebellum is our coordination. But the frontal lobe, as mentioned, is where IQ and EQ come together. And scientific studies show the frontal lobe is the seat of spirituality, morality, and also the will. This is where your self-control comes from. Now, there are other creatures that have brains and even have frontal lobes. Only 3.5% of a cat brain is in the frontal lobe. Not much morality in a cat. If you've seen it torture its victims to death and enjoy the process. Anyone who enjoys torture, it's a sign of serious frontal lobe compromise. Dogs have a little more frontal lobe. They're not the most moral creatures. They won't hesitate to murder if they have to, but they do it much more mercifully. They don't like torture. And they're able to identify and empathize with other creatures and even with human beings. Your cat doesn't really seem to care whether you're home or not, but your dog likes it when you come home. And that's because of that frontal lobe aspect of empathy. Chimpanzees have the most of any other animal species. 17% of their brain is in their frontal lobe. But what sets us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom is our frontal lobe size. 33 up to 38% of the brain is in the frontal lobe, and this is what gives us the ability to accomplish advanced planning and thinking. When the frontal lobe is compromised in an individual, we will see definite effects. Moral principle will go down. Social impairment begins to occur. It's natural to love family members. When that natural love for family goes away, it's often due to a problem in the frontal lobe. Lack of foresight occurs. Our ability to reason from cause to effect is a frontal lobe phenomena. How long we're planning in the future has to do with the frontal lobe. Abstract reasoning is impaired when the frontal lobe goes down. So even our ability to interpret the symbols of Proverbs and Daniel, Revelation can go down. Mathematical understanding is diminished. We talked about math being parietal lobe, but higher forms of math like calculus and algebra, higher forms of algebra require the frontal lobe. Empathy is very much a frontal lobe phenomena, our ability to be able to feel what others feel even though we haven't gone through it just by hearing their story. Lack of restraint occurs when the frontal lobe goes down. Boasting, hostility, loss of temper, and those type of things. And then there are some things that go up when the frontal lobe goes up. Creativity will go up when our frontal lobe circulation is enhanced. There are two essential components, being original and adaptive, making a positive contribution to the life of others. There are some people that pride themselves in being creative because they think they're original, but in reality, they're just bizarre. They're not making any positive contribution to anyone's life as a result of their originality. But being truly creative means that you're original and it's being useful, making a positive contribution. Interest goes up. It's fun to interact with someone who's intrigued by everything. And people with well-functioning frontal lobes, they might be sentenced to a room like this for hours and told they can't leave. They might be disappointed at first that they can't leave and wondering why they're being singled out. But if you have a good frontal lobe, within minutes, you'll actually begin to study something that's very highly interesting to you in this room. And when someone does come a few hours later and say it's time for you to leave, you're not sure you want to leave because you're in the midst of studying something that's very interesting. And that's the way it is when that frontal lobe goes up. And if curiosity can be cultivated, which it can be like it did in Lance, no one need ever search for interesting experiences. One will simply have them. In our society today, kids complain about being bored more so than at any other time in human history. And what they're telling you is, my frontal lobe is not working. Because if the frontal lobe is working well, even though there might not be some stimulating things happening around them or a device to turn to try to help their boredom, they'll actually engage in something or think of something to engage in that will be interesting to them. And they can create their own positive interests. Now, there are ways of impairing the frontal lobe. Drugs impair it, whether it's the illicit drugs such as cocaine, marijuana, heroin, but even some prescription drugs. We talked about the benzos, and this is why we have to weigh the benefits versus the risk. In this country, we're making a very poor decision by what is going on in the marijuana world. Massive 4-decade study published in 2012 by the National Academy of Sciences. Followed more than 1,000 subjects from birth till age 38. The researchers' core finding, repeated marijuana use does what? Lowers IQ how? Permanently. And it also lowers motivation and EQ tremendously. In fact, it will lower your motivation for just about anything except where you're going to get your next marijuana from. And it will increase your motivation in that particular area. We've had a lot of marijuana users come to our program, and one of their common complaints is, I have no self-control. But you know, everyone has even selective self-control. As I talk to them, they're very particular about watering their marijuana plant when it needs to be watered and using the right soil. And you know, they'll have very meticulous self-control in regards to that particular area. But in regards to other more important areas of their life, they're lacking it. And then there are legal drugs that impair. Alcohol suppresses the frontal lobe of the brain first before it affects any other portion of the brain. And of course, we know it affects the judgment. Actually, at lower levels, it doesn't affect the coordination. This is why if you're driving at the legal limit of alcohol intoxication in Maryland, and by the way, is alcohol a problem in Maryland? It is a major problem in Maryland. Probably shouldn't say this in public, but my son, who's a senior medical student, he did a rotation in shock trauma in Baltimore, Maryland. And his attending physicians and things like that, and the residents and things like that, their whole life revolved around, during their off times, drinking alcohol. Even the professionals. And it's something that actually pays a toll on them. You know, there's a baseball player. His name is Miguel Cabrera. He won the Most Valuable Player awards. But he's worshipped by the rest of the baseball players because he'll have a couple of drinks and he'll go out and hit home runs on curveballs. But he gets into auto accidents on his way home from the ballpark. Lots of them. And he has all sorts of relationship problems and all sorts of problems with his family. But that's because alcohol suppresses the frontal lobe before it affects the coordination. And it's not because he's not coordinating that he's getting into accidents. He's doing things with the automobile that's impossible. He's attempting to do things that's impossible to do, even under the best of coordinative circumstances. That's what Princess Di's driver did. He was walking normally, conversing normally, but he attempted to negotiate a turn in a tunnel that was impossible to negotiate, even in the best of coordinative circumstances. Studies show just one drink, you're legal, one drink doubles your risk of an auto accident. And by the time you're at the legal limit, you're at 11 times the rate of an automobile accident. The next day, however, you can drive safely once the alcohol's out of the system. But let me ask you this, does it take critical thinking to drive an automobile successfully? It actually doesn't. That's why we allow 16-year-olds to do it. It requires judgment, but not critical thinking. But the studies show once alcohol's on board, it destroys your, not totally destroys, but it impairs your critical thinking ability for 30 days. Afterwards. Now, where does that play a role? That plays a role if you're flying an airplane from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, France, under instrument conditions at night, and one of your instruments goes bad. That happened a few years ago. And the pilots had 7.5 minutes to figure out which instrument was bad. There's only 6 primary instruments in flying an airplane under instrument conditions. And they could have figured it out, but it required critical thinking because it wasn't a particular scenario that they had trained for. And see, this is the problem with our education today. You have to have every scenario spelled out for them to actually have them to know it and learn it and be able to apply it. But if you're a critical thinker, you just need to have the concepts explained, and then you can think outside the box. And there were 3 pilots. 3 pilots. They're looking at the instruments, trying to figure out what was going wrong. And they never did figure it out. And the entire airplane, themselves and all of the people, died in the Atlantic Ocean. Probably should tell you what it was. It was their airspeed indicator that was showing too high of an airspeed. And it wasn't showing it accurately. An airplane has a limiter. There is a limit in regards to how fast any airplane can go because the wind will break it up. And so when the airspeed goes up, there's one way an airplane will slow it down if the computers are going to kick in. And this was an Airbus. The pilots will talk about Airbus versus Boeing. Airbus doesn't trust human beings as much as it does computers. And so it'll keep the computer in charge unless there's a bunch of factors involved where the pilot can disengage the computer and override it. Boeing still trusts people more than computers, and it puts the person in charge. But this was an Airbus, and so they allowed the computer system to continue to act, because how does an airplane slow down in flight? If it's going too fast, there's two ways you can slow an airplane down in flight. You can decrease the throttle, or you can point it up to the sky. And it was on cruise, and so it just pointed it up to the sky. And it showed the airspeed slowing back down into where it should be, but the problem was the altitude was dropping precipitously. It was in what we call a tail stall. And they're looking at that saying, we don't know why we're in this tail stall, but we're going down fast. What's going wrong? All they needed to do was to nose that plane over and pick up airspeed again and ignore the airspeed indicator. But instead, they all died. Why? Those three pilots had all had alcohol within the last 4 days. Pilots who have looked at that, even basic pilots, think, there's no way I would have not been able to figure that out in 7.5 minutes. But when you don't have critical thinking, you won't be able to figure it out. Nicotine has a more subtle effect in suppressing the frontal lobe of the brain. But caffeine actually also suppresses it. Caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the frontal lobe, and studies have shown you're actually more likely to gossip with caffeine on board. The study that was done on gossip had to define it. Gossip was sharing private information with someone who's not part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. And when you have caffeine on board, you're much more likely to do that because you don't have the break there in the frontal lobe. But it goes beyond that. The quarterback coaches in the National Football League are catching up with this. But I don't know how many of you, I know it's the most popular sport in America, but I know not all of you are Native Americans here, but we'll see if you can get this question right. I'll give you some factual information first and then see if you can get the question right. The factual information is there's only one person on a National Football League field that requires an intact frontal lobe to be successful. It's the quarterback. Why is that? He's analyzing all of this information and he's having to make a decision with the ball. And he has to analyze this information under stress. And studies show very clearly the quarterback makes much better decisions when there's no caffeine on board. And they haven't had caffeine for at least 14 days beforehand, so that they're able to make the brain chemicals enough. If you consume caffeine regularly, one of your brain chemicals will go down significantly, and then when you don't consume it, then you're a zombie. And so you have to go through that 14-day withdrawal. And it makes a huge difference in performance. Probably what many are considering could be the best quarterback in history. Mentioned the other day, as he's still playing football, mentioned the other day that he's never consumed caffeine his entire life. Doesn't know what it tastes like. And of course, at this time, the evidence was already coming out, and so other quarterback coaches are telling their quarterbacks to get off caffeine and all of that sort of thing. If it make a difference in decision-making there, it's actually better for us not to consume it as well. Interestingly, Ellen White wrote about this. She said, when these tea and coffee users meet together for social entertainment, the effects of their pernicious habit are manifest. All partake freely of their favorite beverages, and as the stimulating influence is felt, notice what happens. Their tongues are loosened, and they begin the wicked work of doing what? talking against others. Their words are not few or well chosen. But many people feel it's necessary in my case, because without it, I'm a zombie. This study was done in Great Britain. Frequent consumers feel alerted by caffeine, especially by their morning tea, coffee, or other caffeine-containing drinks. Evidence indicates that this is actually merely the reversal of the fatiguing effects of acute caffeine withdrawal. In fact, measurements showed that caffeine users' post-caffeine levels of alertness were actually no higher than non-caffeine consumers who received a placebo, suggesting caffeine only brings coffee drinkers back up to what? Normal. In other words, all the reported benefits of caffeine are present virtually all day, only in those who don't consume it. Because you'll be able to be alert the entire day and won't have those peaks and valleys. I don't think we have audio, so I might skip this, but this is a researcher from Duke University giving a cup of caffeine to an ABC reporter. This is their brain circulation before caffeine. This is after caffeine. 40% decrease in circulation just by consuming that one cup. And there's no red bells or whistles going off saying, don't get into a conversation with your friend. You're about ready to gossip. Nothing like that. Or there's no bells and whistles going off saying you're about ready to make a bad decision with this ball as soon as you're under duress. This is something that but research shows it makes a significant difference. Well, what does the frontal lobe desire for optimal function? Its natural carbs are used almost exclusively by the brain for optimal function. Fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. And of course, they have a lot of other benefits, antioxidant benefits, and vitamin C benefits, and we could go on. After quoting these 4 food groups, Ellen White says they impart a strength, a power of endurance, and what else? Vigor of intellect that are not afforded by a more complex and stimulating diet. But when carbs were found to be beneficial, people thought sugar would be beneficial. I remember in the 3rd grade being handed a candy bar and said, here, have some brain food. But actually, it hadn't been studied yet. Large amounts of sugar have actually been demonstrated to do what? Impair frontal lobe functions in school-age children, but also it impairs it in adults. And it does that because of the rapid blood sugar shift. When we eat a candy bar, our pancreas thinks we've had a large amount of fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables. And so it cranks out a lot of insulin to bring that sugar down, and then it overshoots it. And once that sugar goes down to hypoglycemia, it takes 4 hours for the frontal lobe to recover from that. So you can do memory things, but if you're having to problem solve, it's going to make a big difference. And this study even showed in kids, 3, 4, 7, and 8.5, and it was controlled for all the known factors that affected IQ. And it showed a 5-point lower IQ in the 20 percentile that was at the bottom compared to the 20 percentile at the top. But if you look at the top 1 percentile that was plant-based, it showed a significant more than 5-point advantage. Arachidonic acid, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule, also decreases the ability to make acetylcholine, an important neurotransmitter. And it's present in eggs, also in meat and fish. It's not present in dairy or any plant foods. We're told eating much flesh will diminish intellectual activity. Students would accomplish much more in their studies if they did what? Never tasted meat. When the animal part of the human nature is strengthened by meat eating, the intellectual power diminishes proportionately. Physical exercise is also good for the brain. Getting fit. Last year we had Dr. John Rattay, who won the award for the top psychiatrist of the year last year because of his work on physical exercise in the brain. And he makes a compelling point. Exercise is much better for your brain than it is even your body. And it's very good for your body, but it's even better for your brain. And how much more the brain will be able to retain and do well when you are on a fitness type program and continue to get fitter and fitter. But working with one's own hands in a real world 3D environment is also imperative for full cognitive and intellectual development. There are sports that prohibit you from utilizing your hands. And those sports might be okay as far as fitness is concerned of your legs, but they're not the best as far as frontal lobe sports. Frontal lobe sports are going to be involving working with your hands in 3 dimensions. And even washing dishes for 20 minutes will actually be better than playing soccer. Research is showing that increasing time spent in the virtual world of computers is displacing hands-on play and hands-on learning. 3D learning allows young people to experience how the world works in practice, to gain an understanding of materials and processes, and to make informed judgments about abstract concepts. And then it's not just what we ingest and put into our body or what we're doing with our body, but also what we are viewing with our eyes. This comes from a hypnosis textbook that tries to support it. It says hypnosis attempts, and notice what it says, to cancel out what? Frontal lobe functions and bring people into a trance in which they are highly suggestible. And then it tells you easy ways to do it. The easiest way is by training the eyes to focus in on one object, the best object being a little flickering light. The person will record information and duties without interpretation or without frontal lobe activity. Now, it's important that the hypnotist be in charge of the light flicker. It's going to be an irregular flicker. But as you keep your eyes focused on that object and have that flickering light, within 90 seconds to 3 minutes, the frontal lobe is going to go down. Many people are unaware that they could have a hypnotic instrument in their own home. What trains the eyes to focus and flickers? It's actually entertainment television. And what produces the flicker is the scene of reference change. In entertainment television, the average scene of reference changes every 3 seconds. In educational TV, it might be the same scene of reference for 30 minutes, and that won't suppress the frontal lobe of the brain. There have been over 3,000 studies done on the effect of television in the mind, and they all show a decline in frontal lobe function, the entertainment television. It increases daydreaming, decreases creative ingenuity, decreases interest in reading, decreases interest in learning, reduces discernment, trains in non-reaction, increases aggressiveness, and reduces sensitivity to violence, and it's also addictive. More TV adolescents watch, the more likely they are to develop what 2 problems? Attention problems and learning problems, and do poorly in school in the long run. The amount of TV kids watched when they were 14 was positively linked with having attention problems later, not doing homework, being bored at school, not finishing high school, and even hating school, the researchers found. 14-year-olds who added 1 more daily hour of TV doubled their risk of academic failure at age 16. Doubled their risk by 1 hour. And at the very least, it takes away precious time for family, achievement, and spiritual pursuits. Eric Braverman, a neurology expert, says television mesmerizes people and turns them into intellectual spectators. It feeds passivity and makes you what? Less engaged. Wheeler Dixon, professor of film studies, University of Nebraska, says TV also acts as a pacifier, a sort of virtual escape, but it is one that never satisfies and only leaves the viewer wanting more of the same emptiness. The researchers go on to say that reading is a much better substitute for your brain and creativity. The greatest thing, it stimulates both sides of the brain. This is when principles combined with illustrations or story to solidify the principles are used. Alvin Toffler, one of the prime media experts in this nation, says constant stimulation of the senses does what to the analytical processes? Shuts down the analytical processes, ultimately shuts down the ability to face life how? Rationally, and this leads to escape techniques that involve withdrawal, apathy, and rejection of what kind of thinking? Disciplined thinking when faced with difficult duties and decisions. That's when we need disciplined thinking, when we have difficult duties and decisions. But when our mind has been set up and programmed by TV, we actually reject disciplined thinking at the very time that we need it. And what brings this all about? Constant stimulation of the senses. And our young people are attracted to these screens that stimulate. and they're wanting YouTube, and they're wanting all sorts of things in order to try to, quotes, not be bored, and they'll go from one thing to another, not realizing what's happening with their brain. You know, it's interesting, when these smartphones and things came out, people were all talking about the great things, connectivity, and all of this thing we'll be able to do research easier, but we were only looking at the benefits and not the risks. And there are tremendous risks to utilizing these devices in unintelligent ways. And these risks are actually pretty profound. Speaking of digital classroom tools, we've got excited, collaboration, connection, but these devices can also be what? Distracting to students. Similarly, parents complain when students are required to complete homework assignments online. It's a challenge for students to remain on task. They have every intention of doing their homework. I'm going in and I've got to do this homework online. You go in there 5 minutes and they're not doing their homework. They loaded their homework up and within 2 minutes they're off their homework. What happened? Well, someone gave them a text on Facebook. They saw that they were connected. Another text message came in, and then CNN did a news flash on what Donald Trump said about some woman. And they got to see what Donald Trump said again this time. And so they're being constantly distracted. If students don't learn how to concentrate and shut out distractions, research shows they'll have a much harder time succeeding in almost every area of life. The real message is, because attention is under siege more than has ever been in human history, we have more distractions than ever before. We have to be more focused on doing what? Cultivating the skills of attention. If young students don't build up the neural circuitry that focused attention requires, they could have problems controlling their emotions and being empathetic. And that's because the circuitry for paying attention in your brain is identical for the circuits for managing distressing emotions. The attentional circuitry needs to have experience of sustained episodes of concentration, reading the text, understanding and listening to what the teacher is saying in order to build the mental models that create someone who is well educated and who can think critically. The author of this book, let's go back to it, Daniel Goleman, you might recognize his name. He was the one who coined the phrase emotional intelligence in 1990. But he's written a new book called Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. And he says one of the keys to success is a digital Sabbath. How often? Every day. That means where you're not connected at all to digital stuff and can't get any messages and can't get any distractions. Sometime when kids, he's focusing in on kids, but now the studies are showing adults are also affected by this. Sometime when kids aren't being distracted by devices at all, are engaged in focused learning. By the way, the best time to have your digital Sabbath? 3 hours before bedtime. You shouldn't be reading screens. You should only be reading printed books if you are reading, studies show, because it's going to even affect your melatonin output. And that's when we get into attention deficit trait. This is a new psychological diagnosis. Core features are distractibility, inner frenzy, impatience. It's increased tenfold in the last 10 years, and like the traffic jam, it's entirely an artifact of modern life. It's entirely environmental, and it's caused by brain overload. It's brought on by the demands of our time and attention that have exploded over the past 2 decades. As our minds fill with noise, useless synaptic events signifying nothing, the brain gradually loses its capacity to attend fully and thoroughly to anything. Symptoms of ADT come upon a person gradually. We had an individual in our last program, very successful, leading a business organization. But he was running into major issues with anxiety, and his memory was being affected. And what he would do, his business, he thought required it, but what he would do was have these big screens in front of him and answering emails from this person or that person and getting text messages and then researching this. And he was constantly turning from one thing to another over the course of time. And just like in him, the symptoms came upon him gradually. A sufferer doesn't experience a single crisis, but rather is a series of minor emergencies while he or she tries harder and harder to keep up. Shouldering a responsibility to suck it up and not complain as the workload increases. People with ADT do whatever they can to handle a load they simply cannot manage as well as they'd like. The ADT sufferer therefore feels a constant low level of panic and guilt. Facing a tidal wave of tasks, the person becomes increasingly hurried, curt, peremptory, and unfocused while pretending that everything is fine. First, you must recognize it, and then control it, you must. The frontal lobe governs what is called, aptly enough, executive functioning. EF, or executive functioning, guides decision-making, planning, organization, and prioritization of information and ideas. It also guides time management, various other sophisticated, uniquely human managerial tasks. As long as our frontal lobes remain in charge, everything is fine. But when you are doing well and operating at peak level, the deep centers send up messages of excitement, satisfaction, and joy. They pump up your motivation. They help you to maintain attention. They don't interfere with working memory, the number of data points you can keep track of all at once. But when you are confronted with the sixth decision, after the fifth interruption, in the midst of a search for the ninth missing piece of information, on the day that the third deal has collapsed and the 12th impossible request has blipped unbidden across your computer screen, your brain begins to panic, reacting just as if that sixth decision were a bloodthirsty man-eating tiger. In survival mode, the person makes impulsive judgments, angrily rushing to bring closure to whatever matter is at hand. He feels compelled to get the problem under control immediately to extinguish the perceived danger lest it eventually destroy him. He is robbed of his flexibility, his sense of humor, his ability to deal with the unknown. He forgets the big picture and the goals and values he stands for. He loses his creativity and his ability to change plans. He desperately wants to kill the metaphorical tiger. And at these moments, he is prone to melting down, to throwing a tantrum, to blaming others, or to sabotaging himself. Or he may go in the opposite direction, falling into denial and total avoidance of the problems attacking him, only to be devoured. And this is attention deficit trait. Studies show every time you multitask, you aren't just harming your performance in the moment, you may very well be damaging an area of your brain that's critical to your future success. Stanford University said multitasking, those who do multitask, they're less productive than doing a single thing at a time. And the researchers found that people who are regularly bombarded with several streams of electronic information cannot pay attention, recall information, or switch from one job to another, as well as those who complete one task at a time. Some people think they have a special gift for it. I've run into a lot of young people who say, I need to have these distractions for little breaks because I don't have the concentration. And Stanford University compared groups of people based on their tendency to multitask and their belief that it helped their performance. They found out heavy multitaskers, those who multitask a lot and feel that it boosts their performance, were actually worse at multitasking than those who like to do a single thing at a time. Frequent multitaskers perform worse because they had more trouble organizing their thoughts and filtering out irrelevant information, and they were slower at switching from one task to another. People at University of Sussex, researchers in the UK, compared the amount of time people spent on multiple devices, TV, texting, to MRI scans of their brains. They found that high multitaskers had less brain density in the anterior cingulate cortex, a region responsible for what? Empathy, as well as cognitive and emotional control. Neuroscientist Keith Kilo, the study's lead author, explained, I feel it's important to create an awareness that the way we are interacting with devices might be changing the way we think, and these changes might be occurring at the level of brain structure. And of course, nothing turns people off quite like fiddling with your phone or tablet during a conversation. Multitasking in meetings and other social settings indicates low self and social awareness, two EQ skills that are critical to success at work. And Talent Smart has tested more than 1 million people, found that 90% of top performers have what? High EQs. Multitasking does indeed damage the anterior cingulate cortex, as current research suggests. Multitasking will lower your EQ while it alienates your coworkers. So if you're prone to multitasking, it's not a habit you'll want to indulge. Clearly slows you down, decreases the quality of your work, and so you need to come with a plan. And that plan is, when you are working on things on your computer screen, get rid of all other aspects of being distracted. Your text messages, emails, you ought to do those all at one time for a short period of time every day and be done with them. And don't allow yourself to be continually bombarded with this type of distraction. The increasing number of bleeps, notification distractions lead to stress, burnout, and ineffective working. And when people think they're multitasking, they're actually just switching from one task to another very rapidly. And every time they do so, there's a cognitive cost in doing so. So this essentially means that, quotes, by being productive and doing multiple tasks at once, you're actually being ineffective. How ineffective are you being? University of London, multitasking actually reduces your IQ, with multitasking men dropping an average of how many points? 15 points, effectively giving them the same cognitive capabilities as an 8-year-old child. And we wonder why people act like 8-year-olds? This may be the reason. Because it's not only IQ that's dropping, it's EQ as well. So start by batching all email activities into set times throughout the day. Outside of those times, don't check your email box. Segregate action items and to-do lists so that you can crush each group separately. Remember, multitasking is inefficient. For tasks that take intense focus, you need to turn off and remove yourself from digital distractions. Activities such as writing personalized emails, writing reports, creating marketing copy, conducting research, all require what? Freedom to think. And this also goes for more routine activities such as organizing files, preparing presentations, and other administrative tasks. Start by planning your time accordingly. If you need an hour to do a task, block out the time in advance so you're both prepared and free from distractions. Before settling down to do this task, make sure you have all the materials, research, contacts, and so on ready. So you want to start so that you don't have to search through programs and files during your work block, which will cause more distractions. When you're ready to start work, tune out and turn off the multitude of digital distractions. That means Facebook, Slack, Twitter, email box. Then without notifications, constantly pinging on your screen, you'll actually get some meaningful work done. And what we're finding out is many times these diagnoses, depression, ADHD, bipolar, studies show you might be barking up the wrong tree coming up with those diagnoses. They look like textbook cases of mental disorder, but failing to rule out and address some of the most common environmental cause of symptoms, which is the everyday use of electronics. And that's why many psychiatrists, Dr. Duncan is one of the ones, she'll be speaking at our EQ Summit, talks about how her first thing that she does before diagnosing these mental disorders is get rid of screens in these people for at least 4 weeks. None whatsoever. You might have a dumb phone, but no more smartphone, no laptop, no computers, those type of things. And in 4 weeks, it's amazing what will happen with the brain changing and EQ improving. Time and again, I've realized, regardless whether there exists any true underlying diagnosis, successfully treating a child with mood dysregulation today requires methodically eliminating all electronics use for several weeks to allow the nervous system to reset. She's wrote a book on this called Resetting Your Brain. And you'll get deeper and better sleep, better mood, better focus, organization, the ability to tolerate stress improves, meltdowns diminish, person begins to enjoy the things they used to, is more drawn to nature, and imaginary or creative play returns in young people. In teens and young adults, an increase in self-directed behavior is observed when you get rid of the screens, the exact opposite of apathy and hopelessness. And the more screen time, the studies show, the less sleep as well. Music also plays a role in regards to EQ and IQ. We could go into more of that. But I know it's late, and some of you want to ask questions afterwards as well. And so let's just summarize. How to take care of our frontal lobe. Protect it from mechanical injury. Supply it with good oxygen. Give it good nutrition. Get adequate sunlight. That's important for serotonin in the brain. Just like a muscle, if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. So we must exercise our frontal lobe. Control the inputs. Correct distorted thoughts. Prevent or control disease that affects it, like high blood pressure. One of the best ways of exercising is this. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica in that they received the word with all what? readiness of mind, and search the scriptures how often? Daily. Would that our people search it weekly, but this was a daily exercise. This helps with the frontal lobe enhancement. So do you want to be more intelligent, more analytical, make better decisions, have a greater capacity to empathize with others, have better discernment, greater ability to see into the future, greater ability to overcome an addiction, or a greater power to follow your conscience? If you answer yes to any of those questions, or if you want to be more open to understanding and doing the will of God, I would encourage you, as we're getting ready to close, to look at your life habits and see what you can do, either in regards to what you're putting into your body, what you're doing with your body, or what you're doing with your time, even in regards to screens and television, so that your frontal lobe can improve. Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his 3 friends made a choice in regards to diet. And God says, dear youth, God calls upon you to do a work which through his grace, you what? You can do. Show a purity of taste, appetite, and habits that bears comparison with whose? Daniel's. God will reward you with 4 things, she says. Calm nerves, clear brain, unimpaired judgment, keen perceptions. The youth of today whose principles are what? Firm and unwavering, not may be blessed, but what? Will be blessed with health of body, mind, and soul. Then this encouraging statement, the Lord has given man capacity for what? Continual improvement has granted him all possible aid in the work. Through the provisions of divine grace, we may attain almost to the excellence of angels. This is what is possible. Your brain, even today, under these fallen conditions, can obtain almost to the excellence of angels if we put into practice in our daily lives the things that can optimize our brain. Paul said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a what? Living sacrifice. That means these are things that we don't necessarily want to do. In fact, on the outset, they seem like, oh, I don't know, I think I'm going to have less enjoyment in my life if I get on a brain optimizing program. What? Give up Seinfeld? Or, what? Give up chocolate mousse? And it's interesting, although I've taken care of a lot of critical care patients, I'm still a critical care doctor 3 days a month just to keep my skills up. So I take care of the deadliest diseases out there. And after doing that for 26 years, I've signed a lot of death certificates. But in people going through the death and dying stage, I've never had one person say, I wish I would have had more chocolate mousse. Or I wish I would have watched more Sopranos. Or whatever the TV show is. You never hear that. What you do hear is, I wish I would have spent more quality time